So this week's soundbite has been given by Charles Seaford from the New Economics Foundation. Charles has done very important work on promoting new measures of social progress, on looking at issues of well-being, made a very important contribution to housing policy in the UK, and indeed to the way in which we think about not only the economy, but the future of the UK itself. So please welcome Charles.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you very much for coming. I think I've got just 15 to 18 minutes. This presentation is called Subjective Wellbeing, as you can see, Subjective Wellbeing Evidence and Economic Policy. Quite a lot of the subjective wellbeing evidence is used to guide social policy of one kind or another, but I'm going to focus on its implications for how we manage the economy, because I think it's there that it has potentially some of the most disruptive implications. And our presentation is in three parts. I probably won't get to the third part, we'll run out of time. But there are three sort of things I want to say. Very briefly, what the role of wellbeing evidence is in economic policy, just to sort of frame what I'm going to say. Then I'd like to go through some of that evidence and the implications it has for policy. And then I'd like to talk about how you manage trade-offs, because obviously most policy making is about managing trade-offs, and wellbeing evidence gives you a kind of new way to manage trade-offs. Start with the traditional approach to economic policy. And this is a bit of a caricature. But broadly speaking, economic policy is designed to maximize growth and ensure that markets are efficient. And if those two things happen, then everybody will be better off. Welfare will go up. That's the sort of basic underlying assumption, with some modification. Of course, that's not the only kind of policy that takes place in government. There are lots of other kinds of policy, broadly speaking, social policy, environmental policy, what have you, which runs in parallel to that. On the whole, when there's a conflict between economic policy, that is to say, well-being as seen by economic departments, and other forms of policy, economic policy tends to trump other areas. So in planning policy, for example, GDP growth looms very large in the decision-making that takes place. If we were to introduce well-being, not simply well-being measurement, not simply into these other policy intervention areas, other policy areas, but into economic policy, then there's a chance perhaps to get a more balanced approach to policy. So what we're really saying is using wellbeing evidence for economic policy implies a more integrated policy process, in which, yes, indeed, you can make policy interventions which enhance growth or make markets more efficient, but you also need to consider all kinds of other outcomes, other intermediate outcomes. And it's the combination of these things which will actually, and the way they interact, which will actually drive the overall level of well-being, which is, after all, the ultimate objective of all policy. It will ensure, if you like, that we can target what policymakers are now calling good growth rather than bad growth. So that's just a sort of framing for it. And the question is, what actually does drive good growth as opposed to bad growth? In other words, what actually do we need to look at in order to make sure that our various interventions are working to maximize well-being? Well, I mean, there's plenty of evidence on what drives well-being. There's a whole literature on this, and some of these are very heavily influenced by economic policy. And I'll go through, these are 9 important, they're not the only ones, but these are 9 important drivers of well-being. And I'll go through these more or less one by one. So income. Income, of course, is a very, very important driver of well-being. And here you can see satisfaction with life against annual household income. And it follows the pattern that's predicted by standard economic theory for a long time, declining marginal utility of income. It fits that pattern, broadly speaking. But you can see it's quite interesting. This is household income. It's quite interesting. When you get to about 40,000 a year, it really does level off. Maybe a bit less than that, sort of high, 38 to 40,000 a year household income is the point at which actually you're really beginning to get much less. I mean, there are these 2 outliers, it's true, but that's a relatively small number of people. in the sample, small number of people. So that obviously has implications for economic policy.
Overseas individual countries?
No, this is UK. This is in the UK. This is based on the Understanding Society survey. So this is UK household income. So yeah, if you did it for the internationally, the figures would be much lower. Yeah. So that's income. And housing is a you might say housing is just another consumption item, so you consider it alongside income, but actually it's a particularly important form of consumption, and it's a particularly important driver of well-being. And you can see here that the insecurity associated with the possibility of having to leave your home is a big driver of dissatisfaction. The important figures here actually are the totally clear, but it's the paler ones which are life satisfaction. And you might think 0.58 doesn't sound very big, but actually that's a big shift in levels of life satisfaction. Unemployment, we'll come on to that, is 1.2. So 0.58, if you think you're going to have to leave your home, it's a big decline in your income. And if you just go back to the previous slide, you'll see that we've really got, that's really the difference in someone's income of between sort of 18 and 60,000. So or more. So that is a big impact. So housing is obviously very important, and obviously these other aspects of housing problems are also important, but that's a particularly big one. So security of tenure for tenants might be considered a very important piece of economic policy. Inequality, of course, the declining marginal utility of income point means that equality in general is going to be a good idea. That's sort of well-known, well-established. But also, of course, you'll be probably familiar with the Wilkinson and Pickett work, which shows that inequality has other routes to impact, other pathways to well-being. It impacts through, for example, health and social problems, and this is one of their charts, which I won't expand on particularly. Employment, I've already mentioned that. Employment, you look at the contrast, the life satisfaction of the employed with the unemployed for less than 12 months and the unemployed for 12 months or more, and you'll see very big difference. Incidentally, it's not the work. So as you can see, retired and students have the highest level of well-being of all. So it's not actually that you have to be working to make yourself happy, but it's obviously it's the insecurity and the income insecurity in particular that's associated with that. And that's also picked up by this chart, where finding from the UQLS survey, having a temporary contract basically damages your well-being by about half as much as being unemployed. So it's a very interesting finding, it seems to me. Unemployment will reduce your lifestyle by about 1.2 points on the 0 to 10 scale. Having a temporary contract, about 0.52. So that's quite significant. And this is a similar finding which I won't go into. Right hours, not working all the hours that God gives is not surprisingly good for your well-being. And the critical point seems to be around 40 hours, which is the norm. These people down here it has a negative impact if they're working these very long hours. Not that surprising, I suppose. Debt is an important thing, not your ordinary mortgage, of course. A little bit of damage there, but it's the informal loans. It's have a very serious impact. Having one item of debt, it says here, same effect on life satisfaction, a 29% loss of income. So very serious if people are getting into debt. Finally, the importance of social effects. This is sort of obvious in a way, but social life and family life is very important. And you might say, what's that got to do with economic policy? They are obviously very important drivers of well-being. But the point is that actually your economic policy will affect geographical labour mobility, working hours, and inequality and deprivation. And each of those in turn will affect the extent to which people can have a decent family and social life. If everyone's moving around the whole time, then their well-being will suffer. Children in particular are known to suffer low levels of well-being when their parents are constantly moving job from one part of the country to another, and that's something that actually affects them later in life as well as at the time. Interesting take here on the whole sort of migration issue. I mean, in Hungary, I'm told that there are parts of the Hungarian countryside where there are some very, very unhappy old people because basically all their family have gone. They've either gone to Budapest or they've gone to other countries. And the social fabric is very, very badly damaged. And this creates a lot of low levels of well-being. So it's about creating, the answer in economic terms is to create jobs, employment, communities where people are and not try and move people around too much. Working hours, obviously, if you have no time to spend with your family, you won't spend time with your family. And one of the reasons why people don't like being poor is it means they can't entertain their friends. I mean, it's one of the most important things. People, it's even more important, slightly more important than getting cold. So, you might say, great, lots of nice evidence. Does this actually have any implications for policy? We can all agree that these are sort of desirable things. Well, I think it does, and I think that, or undesirable things as the case may be, I think it does, and how you actually implement those into policies itself is obviously a detailed matter, but I think you can say, yes, okay, on the basis of that, let's set out some objectives that not simply the growth of the economy, which may or may not be a good idea, but let's say these are our, say, 6 objectives. Everyone needs to have a target band of income for everybody. We don't need really, we're not really worried if people have got income above whatever it is, 40, 50,000. Above that, it's not really making that much difference to well-being. Of course, you've got to manage expectations, you've got to have incentives, and so on and so forth. But to the extent that it's possible, that's not really adding any well-being value above that. In addition, but everyone should be above a minimum level. Additionally, affordable housing for all. You might say that should be an absolutely paramount piece of economic policy objective, absolutely paramount economic policy objective because of the impacts that has on well-being. Stability. Stability, you might decide, is more important than growth. I mean, you can probably trade off stability and growth to some extent. You can probably achieve higher overall growth rates if you're prepared to have periods of slump and periods of downturn. You might say that's not a good idea on the basis of this, because actually what you see that people really care about is not so much maximizing income, but minimizing insecurity. Satisfying work for all, and in the right quantities, that's sort of fine. And also encouraging active forms of consumption, which I didn't talk about. So you could have a set of objectives like that, and then you say, well, how do we achieve that? Well, you could then develop a set of policies, which I'm not going to talk about now, but we have done some work on these at NEF, on industrial strategy, designed to create good jobs that deliver decent income, not reasonably satisfying work in the right quantities, and stable employment. You could have a set of policies around housing in order to manage the land market to ensure that housing was affordable. You could use public sector employment and procurement practices to reinforce your industrial strategy on good jobs. You could bolster trade unionism in order to improve good jobs. Now, these are not necessarily the policies that are currently being advocated, but they are possible policies. They are policies that you could develop if these were your objectives, and you single-mindedly said, okay, how are we going to achieve them? This is what the well-being evidence says we should be doing. But in the real world, of course, policymaking is often about trade-offs, and I just want to finish by some slight change of gear and talk about how does this help you manage trade-offs? So, labour market policy might have impacts on the employment rate, working hours, job security, and income, all of which, if you recall, were things that affect well-being. So, will this help? Will this whole well-being approach help to decide what your labour market policy should be? Well, it might do, because it might help you decide what level of minimum wage to set. It might help you decide what approach to take to labour market flexibility and employment law. And it might help you decide whether or not to implement the Working Time Directive. So take the minimum wage. Basically, let's just simplify a bit and assume that there's a trade-off between the income and between the income effect and the employment effect. Let's just assume that by raising the minimum wage, you will obviously boost people's income, but you will perhaps create a certain amount of unemployment. May or may not be the case. So you can say, sorry, it's gone. So you can say, right, what is the impact of that going to be? What you make an estimate of the increase in unemployment, what the impact that will have on people's well-being. You will make an estimate of what the impact of increasing the income will be on people's well-being, and then you can trade them off. Because you've got a common currency. We put this to Sir David Norgrave, who's chair of the Low Pay Commission. He was horrified because he said we don't want to do what is essentially a political calculation between employment, the trade-off between employment and income. We prefer to operate on the basis that the minimum wage will not create any unemployment. And then we sort of said, you're saying that even if you could raise the minimum wage by £1 an hour, and it would raise unemployment by 10,000 across the country, you'd think that was a bad idea. He said, yes. So that's the sort of paradigm. We say, well, okay, but maybe we can take a sort of more nuanced approach, and it would be better to think what the trade-offs might be. Because in the long term, maybe that unemployment will get sucked up. It'll be dealt with in some way. It's an interesting question. I mean, I'm not actually at this moment going to advocate any given level of the minimum wage, but you can see how the well-being approach, if you can measure it, at least introduces a bit of analysis into the debate, which might otherwise be just a sort of, well, we do what we always do. Labour market flexibility is rather similar. It's a rather similar sort of issue, that trade-off, and between increasing the job security of people in employment and potentially reducing the employment rate. So you can imagine that these are the effects that it has on the people who have become unemployed, and this is the effects that minus 1.2 for every person who becomes unemployed, 0.4 for every person who gets a bit more job security. And then you can do a little calculation, and you end up, in this dummy example, it's just about worth doing. Now again, no one would say that's the be-all and the end-all, but this kind of analysis can actually help you think a bit more about actually what do we want to do in this situation. It doesn't give you the answers, it doesn't tell you the optimal answer, but it gives you a little bit more background analysis. Working time directive is the same kind of thing, basically, slightly more complicated calculation because there are lots of feedbacks and all, it begins to get quite complex. But anyway, that's it. Thank you very much.
Right, we take some questions then. Yes, here, please, first, and then we can...
Could you explain a little more how you calculate the life satisfaction index? Because that first slide you showed, there wasn't a vast difference between the poorest and the richest in society.
Yes, this is one. Yeah.
You were saying quite correctly that it tails off at a relatively low level. People on a very high income are not hugely happier than people on middle income, which has been found worldwide as well. But your very poor people didn't seem to be all that upsetting, something like 5.4.
Yeah, on a scale of 7. Yeah.
Now, is that because, I remember when you have these world surveys of happiness, at the height of gorilla problems and drug problems in Colombia, Colombians declared themselves the second most happiest people in the world. So to what extent is there some distortion? Because the poor are saying, well, despite being poor, we're actually happy.
Poor but happy, yeah. Happy peasant problem.
Your argument would be better if you had a much steeper.
It would. You're absolutely right. And my colleague who produced all these data, we had these conversations some time ago, and I keep having the same conversation with them because I can't believe these numbers. And I say, are you sure that the poor are more miserable? You see, and this becomes a sort of, I say, no, this is what the data show. And so I'm a bit skeptical. But I mean, if you then look at material deprivation as opposed to simple income figures, it's actually a much more vivid picture of well-being impacts, and so there's something wrong. I mean, there's something wrong. You're quite right to pick up on it. I think there's something wrong with the evidence. To be honest with you, I find it quite difficult to believe, and I'm not quite sure how to reconcile these income figures with the figures about material deprivation.
But how do you measure it?
It's measured by people asking, how satisfied are you with your life overall? Which, of course, I mean, that question has been widely criticised because of the frame of reference that people operate within. So if you're the so-called happy peasant problem. You have someone who's very poor, but they have no experience of anything outside their existing life, and so they say they're very satisfied. And that could be used as a justification for the status quo.
And may I also ask, why has health not come up in any of your...
It could, yes, it could have done. I mean, isn't it? Because I would have
thought, if you're ill,
yes.
your life satisfaction is human.
Yes, well, absolutely. Health is one of the biggest drivers, and in fact, I mean, the Wilkinson and Pickett one was about health. The chart inequality and is correlated with health, and that is a big driver of well-being. Yes, absolutely.
I was just wondering if any research has been done on how the sort of surrounding inequality impacts people's well-being. So, because you actually mentioned that sort of people, the social fabric has an important impact on how people perceive well-being. So, how has there been any research saying, well, if we see the impacts, if we see sort of inequalities or how we perceive people around us, how does that impact our...
Yeah. It's an interesting question, actually, because, I mean, there are a number of things there. First is on unemployment, so I'll get to the real question, but on unemployment, one of the interesting things is that, of course, high levels of unemployment in society as a whole lower the well-being of the employed as well as the unemployed. I mean, presumably because they makes them feel anxious. Now, just going to your question, it depends on the society, as I recall. I mean, in some societies, as I understand it, people quite like inequality because they are aspirational and they think that if there's inequality, even if they're at the bottom, they've got a chance of getting to the top, and that's good for their well-being. So in some societies, that's the case. In other societies, it's the opposite. So it very much depends upon the norms in the society. Also, I mean, not surprisingly, left-wing people are more unhappy in unequal societies, and right-wing people are more happy in unequal societies.
And there is some quite good evidence that from the poverty studies, that what really is important is social status and the ability to continue social interactions. And once that stops, then the intersection between poverty and lack of social status becomes quite crushing.
I was just thinking about the kind of model that you get in coordinated market economies that seems to actually align quite well with this approach, and in terms of the kind of strategies that you suggested, industrial policy, maybe labour policy, those kind of things. So I was thinking, if you are in a country like us, which is a liberal market economy, then how massive a kind of change would looking at well-being from this perspective represent? Because it seems like it's almost like anathema to the whole economic model.
Well, that's true. I mean, if you look at someone's done a sort of segmentation of European countries, and they've grouped them into the kind of social democrat countries, the corporatist countries, and the sort of liberal free market countries, and then the Eastern European countries, transition. And obviously the transition are the lowest levels of well-being. Social democratic countries have the highest levels of well-being, corporatist second level, and I mean broadly speaking, and the free market third highest level of well-being. So, I mean, that is, if you like, some sort of broad corroboration of the approach. I mean, it does represent quite a big shift, actually. Yes, I agree. And you will not be surprised, of course, that when David Cameron spoke about the importance of well-being, he didn't really extend the analysis to economic policy. It's all about social policy. It's all about interventions at the level of encouraging volunteering or making communities work better, but not actually interfering with the way the economy works. And he actually drew quite a strong distinction between those aspects of policy which are about giving people more money in their pockets and those aspects of policy which are about putting, as he put it, a smile on their face. So that's the way that it is, at least under the present government.
I just want to ask about the employment paradigm you mentioned, and I wonder would you say that if you increase the minimum wage as a tool to solve unemployment, so you say, as a policymaker, I might increase my unemployment minimum wage, right? So when you're saying that unemployment actually increases as a result, so like as a first reason, I might see that maybe employers, like as a substitution effect, they use, maybe they start to employ less people. But would you, like, which kind of alternative would you suggest, like, as a policy maker, if you want to solve for this, so using wages as a tool, I don't know if you have an idea, like, if you're saying it's a paradigm and it's affected that way, like, is there any alternative ways?
You mean, is there a way of sort of avoiding this trade-off in a way?
Yes.
Well, I mean, in a way, I think that's a good question because in a way, you could say what this tells you, the way you see these trade-offs, is you need to kind of really rethink your policy in order to, if they turn out to be really sharp trade-offs, then you sort of got it wrong somehow, and you need to sort of think of ways to, to manage things so that becomes an absolute priority to try and deal with it. But I haven't got the answer.
One interesting thing about how different societies think about this, so you talk about certain societies being more comfortable with greater levels of inequality than others. Of course, a lot of public opinion, of course, is formed by the media. We had somebody the other day talking about the mansion tax in terms of you can't get a garage in London for under £2 million, and things like that. And that being taken as serious political intervention. And when you've got media who are prepared to play along with that, of course, you end up with, the joke about the American dream is it's exactly that. You have to be dreaming to believe it. You end up with a society, the most unequal society in your graph there being the United States, where millions of hundreds of people or poor people are belying the dream, yet the dream is what's perpetuated by media, really, essentially. And your analysis of which countries are more comfortable with this probably has a lot to do with the political setup within those countries.
I'm sure that's true, yeah.
But the other thing I was more seriously going to ask was about traction, really, and about the ability to make these things stick. It was fascinating to watch welfare reform happen in Britain over the last 4 years, and the DWP doing equalities assessments of the impact of welfare reform, or you end up with the government still claiming that it's going to eliminate child poverty by 2020, when, of course, all of its policies are driving up child poverty in Britain at the moment, and them just standing up in Parliament and saying we're still committed to the 2020 target of eliminating child poverty. What sort of political conversations have you had, and what sort of traction have you found for this approach?
Yeah, okay. Well, two things to say. First of all, you're absolutely right about DWP and the present government and all the rest. I completely agree with you, just as a political level. Funnily enough, we actually did some work for the DWP because we have to earn a living, and they were sort of into this whole well-being thing, and can we use it to get people to work longer hours and claim less under universal credit, you see? And, we told them they couldn't, basically, which they sort of said, oh, well, that's interesting, we'll have to use sanctions. So that's, sorry, that's just by. But in terms of the more, the broader thing, we act as the Secretariat for an all-party parliamentary group on well-being economics, and it is in theory an all-party parliamentary group, but we really only got support from a few Labour and Lib Dem people. So the Conservatives really are not very interested in this anymore. They were a few years ago when it was the kind of becoming thing, but they're not. So there is a bit of traction from the Labour Party. John Cruddas, who is in theory partly responsible for the manifesto, is interested in it. I think that Ed Miliband, I haven't spoken to him about it, but not for 4 years, but he was sort of interested in it. But, it's not where the sort of Balls-Cooper household is. So I don't think that, I'm not convinced that it's going to really drive economic policy after the next election. But I think there are people in the Labour Party who are interested in it, put it that way, and who can see its potential, and who like this kind of stuff, and they can see where it goes, and they think it's good. But But is it where the mainstream of the Labour Party is? Not sure about that.
Yes. Could you see something about the trade-off between the labour protection and the competition and the productivity in the labour market? But this is probably not a trade-off because on the personal level, if the productivity is lower and the competition is lower, it will actually increase the well-being probably. But this is not good for the national economy. So.
Well, yes. I mean, what you've got here. I mean, what we're kind of assuming here is we don't actually know what these impacts are exactly. I mean, so we don't actually, we're not really assuming anything in this chart. We're just saying that if you was this the one you were talking about, or was it the other? Yeah. So if you implement the working time directive, obviously the working hours will go down. That's good for well-being. Employment rate, well, it might go up or down because it might go up because you're working fewer hours and people therefore need to employ more people. It actually might go down if some of your businesses go out of business because the directive is too thin. So all these things are actually, at this level, it starts, you start to think, well, actually we need to do more analysis and more research into what these impacts are actually going to be. But then you can feed that analysis into this kind of model and work out what the net impact is. So, I mean, sorry, my answer to your question is I don't know what the impacts are because we haven't done the analysis of what all these arrows would point. It's all hypothetical. My point is simply that you can create a quite simple little model here, and then you can use the more conventional labour market analysis outputs to feed into that model to give you an answer. Do you see what I'm saying? So it's a sort of slightly pathetic answer, but that's as far as I've got.
So does it make sense if we see that we cannot have a policy that's only trying to maximize the well-being because maybe above certain level increase well-being to the further, it's going to harm the national economy.
Well, but it seems to me that's putting the cart before the horse. I mean, the only reason you want a successful national economy is to boost people's well-being. I would argue. I mean, it's not an end in itself, a successful national economy. I mean, in a modern democracy. I mean, in I don't know, in Sparta or somewhere, it might have been, a different sort of setup, or in, I don't know. I mean, it's true that well-being is not necessarily the only objective of a politic, but I mean, and in fact, we had someone ring us up and say, why do you say that well-being is the objective of policy? If I was a country, this journalist said, which is a rather interesting idea, if I was a country, I wouldn't be interested in my people's well-being. I'd just be interested in being bigger and stronger than other countries. So, yeah, that's a possible objective, but it's probably not the one that we have.
My question goes back to the data, to how this data is actually gathered. And for me, there's a problem with comparing if a poor person says, oh, I'm okay with my housing situation, and if a rich person says, I'm okay with my housing. So they're both on 0.5 maybe. But for me, this 0.5, you can't really compare it. So is there more attempts to make this gathering of information about well-being more objective in terms of you don't ask the person, maybe you let other people rate the person, or is there some kind of things going on with how to gather?
Yeah, there is some tests that are done. I mean, I can't say about those specific housing figures because I'm not quite sure what the tests were. But in general, you can test these subjective questions against objective data. I mean, it can be even brain scans, or, what's going on in your brain, basically, and you measure how people respond to subjective survey questions, and you compare it with what's going on in their minds. Also, you do a sort of intuitive, does this kind of make sense kind of test, and you find that a lot of the variation is explained by things you'd expect to explain things. I mean, actually, although the figures are a bit surprising, actually poor people are less satisfied with their life than rich people. And people in bad housing, as we saw, are less satisfied with their housing than people in good housing. So actually what you find is that, if the results were completely counterintuitive, then I think you might wonder about it. But because the results, A, are quite sort of intuitive, they're not that surprising, and B, you can do these tests against brain scans and what have you, then I think they're reasonably robust. I mean, was that what you were getting at, or were you getting at something beyond that?
This would also maybe. Do you find my question once again? Would you say then, if in one survey the poor person says 5 and the rich person says 5, would you say, okay, they're on the same level? Just when you look at the data, if you're would you say they're on the same level? Would you compare them, or would you say?
Well, I wouldn't take. I mean, if there was about housing, you're talking about housing specifically, or anything, level of satisfaction. Poor person. If it's one person and one rich person, obviously it's just it's not significant. It's just two people, and that's not. But if you did a survey and you had a completely flat, which we don't have, but if it was a completely flat graph between poor people and rich people in life satisfaction, then I think this happy peasant problem that I referred to earlier is really getting quite serious, and I would be a bit sceptical about the whole thing. But that's not the situation we find ourselves in. I mean, when you look at it across the world, you know, people in the poorer parts of Africa have far worse life satisfaction than people in Denmark. So that's just not what actually the data show.
What advantages do you see in asking people for the level of perceived satisfaction rather than the level of perceived happiness?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's a sort of ongoing debate. I mean, in some ways I prefer the happiness question because it's less. The frame of reference point is less acute. I mean, if you look at because with life satisfaction, you are very much likely to compare yourselves with the people in your, you know, how does my life compare with my neighbour's life, and so on and so forth. So it's very much the frame of reference becomes very important. Whereas happiness is just recording an emotion you've had on the previous day. On the other hand, happiness has the problem that it is perceived by many people to be a bit frivolous as a sort of objective of policy, whereas life satisfaction is seen to be something that is more something that governments should be caring about. So there's a sort of validity, you know, face validity point there. I mean, and so I think that I would possibly combine the different measures, because there are 4 different measures that the ONS use. They use life satisfaction, happiness, anxiety, and whether you think your life is worthwhile. And if I was creating a measure of well-being, I might want to combine all 4 in some synthetic way, because they all have the different merits.
So you stick to those questions from here, and then
I sympathise wholly with your belief that government should be trying to maximise well-being, however we define it. But you seem to be assuming that, say, the British government has a great deal of ability to do that, whereas it seems to me that everything's going against the autonomy of the government, the media, globalisation, the European Union is making it sound like UK. The problem is that the way economists think, in terms of GNP being the main ingredient, without allowing for sustainability measures or destroying the environment and so on. Is it not true that the government autonomy has been diminishing since, say, 1950? And that the ability of whatever government that comes in next year will actually be able to affect well-being very little, even if it wanted to do so?
Well, first of all, if you don't know what you want, you're not going to get it. So
No, well, don't say that, please, because I'm being cynical.
No. I actually believe, in my better, happier moments, that there is an opportunity for government. Yeah, no, we can't have socialism in one country. I mean, no one believes that one government can go off and do all this stuff on their own and without, where necessary, coordinating with other governments. And of course, we don't live on an isolated country in the way that UKIP, for example, would like people to think. So that's clear. You have to cooperate with other governments. But, I mean, Mrs. Merkel, for example, I think is going to be chair of the G8 next year. She wants well-being to be the theme of her G8 chairmanship, apparently, I'm told, by people in Germany. So while I think that Mrs. Merkel has got a long way to go before she's a champion of well-being, particularly for people in Southern Europe, I don't think that this agenda, it's not, I said earlier in answer to other questions that it's not getting the sort of traction I would like it to get, but I don't think it's so completely off the wall that it can't actually start to get a bit more traction at European Commission level, within the more progressive countries. I don't think England is actually going to be in the vanguard of this. I think that some other European countries maybe, and I think the Commission maybe to some extent.
Can we just take these two questions together, maybe you and then so that we
It was just like the issue of measurement, and even though I know it's not the main point of the whole kind of talk, I think that, for example, in Wilkinson and Pickett, they're talking about all sorts of different indicators like health. You can look at kind of, social stability as measured by levels of kind of conflict and protest, that kind of thing. So I was just wondering whether you thought that you might gain from looking at those wider indicators as well that aren't based on people's personal responses.
Absolutely. I mean, and that's why I included their chart in this. And I don't. The point about subjective indicators is not that they're the only measure that's useful. Obviously not, or that they necessarily are the best. Or that they capture what's worthwhile most effectively. I mean, clearly health captures something very, very important in itself, and we don't need subjective measures like this to capture that. The point about subjective measures is they allow you to create a single currency, as it were, in sort of wonky terms, cost-benefit analysis, to do these kind of trade-off considerations, because everything can be said to have an impact on your subjective well-being, whether it's health, economy, housing, all these things that I described. They all have an impact, which can be analysed in a regression and what have you, and then you can say, well, if we do this, that's going to happen. So, and then you can do a cost-benefit analysis based upon well-being impacts rather than based on willingness to pay, and so you get a different answer. So I think it's an important point to establish actually that people who advocate subjective well-being measurement, I'm not saying it, some people are, but I'm not anyway. I'm not saying it because we don't think that there's anything else that's valuable. We think this is the only thing that's valuable, or that everything else that's valuable can be reduced to these things. We're just saying it's a useful tool for reconciling what might otherwise be incommensurate goals.
Very quick question and a very quick answer.
Yeah. Obviously, we're all probably relatively familiar or over-familiar with the British situation in terms of this package. Could you comment very briefly about sort of well-being in other countries, and I guess models of countries that have particularly tried to create a more equal society than, ours is amongst the most unequal, I think, only bar Portugal and probably the USA in terms of developed countries. What that looks like in countries that have deliberately tried to be more equal.
Yes, well, I'll just talk about two things. Ecuador is an interesting example. Ecuador I might just suggest you go and sort of read up about Ecuador, because it's a very interesting example. They've reduced the level of poverty there quite radically in the last few years, and they have this concept of buen vivir, which is it's a sort of almost mystical idea, but it's about living well with nature, and that's a sort of animating idea which has sort of guided the government. So I think Ecuador's a good example. But I would also just go back to the point I made earlier about the differences, the social democratic countries in Europe, the Denmarks and Swedens and so on and so forth. Okay, recently they've gone slightly in the other direction, but historically, and compared to us, they are basically equal societies, and they have always continued, and they continue to provide security and equality in a way that we don't, and not surprisingly, the well-being is much higher.
Yes. I'm afraid we have to stop there because the new class coming in. Just to say we've extended the deadline on the IGP challenge, so look at the website. It's now 5th of January, which is popular demand. And thank you very much, Charles.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.